March the 6th, 1944. 27,000 feet above Berlin, minus 40 degrees Celsius. The sky was pale and hard like glass, and the air was thin enough to slice through a man's lungs. At that altitude, every breath felt earned, not granted. In the cockpit of a B-17 flying fortress, the world below was little more than a frozen map, dotted with black smoke and broken cities. The crew was silent, focused eyes, scanning the endless blue and white. They knew what waited for them. They'd seen it before. Then every man aboard a bomber knew the math. 40% wouldn't return. They had read the statistics printed coldly on briefing room walls. They had memorized the formation patterns, the bailout procedures, the final prayers. But this time, something was different. Usually, the fighter escort would turn back somewhere over the Rhine. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings did their best, but they simply didn't have the fuel to go all the way. Beyond a certain line, bombers flew alone, naked, and over Germany, that meant death. The Luftwaffe knew that line well. They waited just beyond it, engines, warm throttles twitching. The Germans called it the death zone. Pilots would take off, knowing they had only minutes of real combat. But that was enough. For months they feasted on American bombers as if it were a sport. But today, that line was crossed. As the formation pushed eastward beyond Leipzig, beyond the safe range of previous escorts, something strange happened. The fighters didn't leave. They stayed. The B-17 gunners noticed first. Eyes widened, hands frozen mid-adjustment. "Is that a Mustang?" one asked. The voice cracked over the intercom. Another replied, "They're still with us." That wasn't supposed to happen. That had never happened. In the cockpits of the Messerschmitts, climbing to intercept confusion turned quickly to alarm. Pilots like Otto Herbig and Karl Wust knew the routine. Wait for the escort to turn back, then dive into the bomber's stream with impunity. But now, their radios were filled with uncertainty. American fighters, still advancing. Impossible, but it was real. Through the canopy, the Germans saw them, sleek, fast, and steady. The silhouettes were unfamiliar. Long noses, pointed tails. Not P-47s, not Lightnings. Something else. The P-51 Mustang. Some German pilots called them ghosts. Others called them demons. But all agreed on one thing. They didn't run out of sky. As the Mustangs roared through the flak-stained sky, something shifted in the air. You could feel it. A psychological crack opening wide across the Luftwaffe's confidence. For the first time in the war, they weren't the hunters. They were being hunted, and it showed. On the ground, Luftwaffe command scrambled to identify what was happening. Reconnaissance had hinted at a new long-range American fighter, but no one believed it could reach Berlin and return. That kind of range was myth, but myths were now flying in formation. Each Mustang was equipped with drop tanks, thin metal, cylinders slung beneath their wings that gave them the fuel to escort the bombers from England to Berlin and back again. It wasn't science fiction. It was Detroit and Derby. It was Rolls-Royce and Packard. It was the brute force of American industry finally catching up to tactical necessity. The silence among bomber crews gave way to disbelief, then cautious hope, then awe. There was a young tail gunner in the 401st Bomb Group who later wrote in his journal, "I saw a Mustang flash past us chasing a 109. We all held our breath. Then we saw it turn back, still with us. I don't think I'll forget that sound. That sound." The deep metallic hum of the Merlin engine at high altitude. It didn't scream like the German fighters. It growled. It didn't pass like wind. It carved through the air like a blade. For the men in the bombers, it was salvation with wings. For the men in the Messerschmitts, it was the edge of a nightmare. One German pilot landed that day pale, silent, and shaking. He didn't speak for hours. When asked what he had seen, he finally whispered, "They were still there, even over Berlin." From that moment forward, everything changed. The myth of Luftwaffe dominance began to unravel, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a subtle shift in the balance of presence. The Americans had found a way to stay, to endure, to dominate not by outmaneuvering, but by outlasting. And for the first time, the sky over Germany no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to something else. To those watching now, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you're as fascinated by these forgotten moments as we are, leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel for more stories that changed the course of history without warning. Months before the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, something had already broken in the command rooms of the 8th Air Force. It wasn't discipline or courage, it was faith. Mission after mission, they were sending their bombers deep into German territory with the hope that enough of them would survive to make a difference. But hope is not a strategy, and over time the losses began to bleed the morale dry. By late 1943, bomber crews knew the odds. 50 bombers out of 200 lost in a single day was not unusual. Entire squadrons disappeared over the Ruhr. Hail gunners watched their friends vanish in silent fireballs. The skies were not a battlefield. They were an execution chamber at 25,000 feet. Commanders filed reports. Generals requested more planes. Better coordination, tighter formations, but none of that addressed the core problem. The bombers were going too far without enough protection. The idea was sound in theory. Precision daylight bombing would strike at the heart of German industry and shorten the war. But in practice, it was slaughter. Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood this, and he did not hesitate. The president made it clear in one of the most consequential behind-closed-doors statements of the war. Either we get fighters to Berlin, or we stop the bombing. That sentence echoed through the Pentagon and across the Atlantic. It wasn't just an order, it was a deadline. At the time, the Americans had fighters. Good ones. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a flying tank. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines and great performance at high altitude, but neither could go all the way to Berlin and back. Their fuel tanks were limited, and their design focused on shorter range interception and ground support. What they needed was something new, or rather, something already overlooked. The P-51 Mustang had been developed not for the U.S. Army Air Forces, but for the British. When the war began, the Royal Air Force needed a new fighter quickly. The Americans at North American Aviation offered a fresh design built around speed, agility, and simplicity. The first versions used an Allison engine, which worked fine at low altitudes but struggled above 15,000 feet. Then came the turning point. British engineers decided to try something bold. They removed the Allison engine and replaced it with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire and Hurricane. But now it was placed in a sleeker, longer-range airframe. The results were immediate. In test flights, the new Mustang outperformed expectations. It was fast, agile, and most importantly, it could climb and fight above 30,000 feet. When American observers saw the data, they didn't ask for more prototypes, they demanded production. By late 1943, the P-51B variant began rolling off the assembly lines. At the same time, engineers introduced underwing drop tanks. These slender fuel pods could be jettisoned once empty, giving the Mustang extraordinary range without sacrificing maneuverability in combat. Suddenly, the United States had what no one else did: a long-range, high-altitude, high-speed escort fighter that could stay with bombers from takeoff to target and back. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a solution. Behind the numbers was something bigger. The Mustang represented more than engineering. It was a symbol of industrial flexibility and coalition thinking. The airframe was American. The engine was British. The fuel tanks were a product of wartime necessity. And together, they created an aircraft that didn't just fill a gap. It changed the nature of the war in the air. Pilots quickly noticed the difference. One veteran from the 354th Fighter Group recalled his first mission escorting bombers over enemy territory in a Mustang. "We passed the point where the Thunderbolts used to turn back. I waited for the call to return to base. It never came. We just kept going. And I looked down, and there was Berlin." That mental shift was massive. The Luftwaffe had built its strategy around timing. They knew exactly when American fighters would leave. They trained to attack in that gap, but the gap was gone, and they weren't ready. On top of that, the Mustang was lethal. Armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, it could cut through enemy fighters in seconds. It was fast enough to catch a fleeing Focke-Wulf and tough enough to survive a hit. German pilots quickly learned that dogfighting a Mustang meant risking your life against an enemy who could outturn, outclimb, and outshoot you. And it was only the beginning. In less than a year, the skies above Europe would change entirely. Not just because of the Mustang itself, but because of what it allowed: full-scale, coordinated strategic bombing with true fighter coverage. A campaign not based on sacrifice, but on pressure. Constant, relentless, calibrated pressure. Even General James Doolittle himself would later say that the arrival of the Mustang was one of the decisive factors that broke the Luftwaffe. The Allies had finally reached the turning point, not through a single battle, but through fuel tanks, blueprints, assembly lines, and a motor designed in Derby. Aviation historians often compare the Mustang to a scalpel: clean, precise, devastating. But that metaphor misses something. Because the Mustang didn't just cut, it bled the enemy slowly over weeks and months. It stayed, and staying was something the Germans could not counter. Before the Mustang, American pilots braced for the moment they would be left alone. After the Mustang, that moment never came. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the aerial turning points of World War II, share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that explore how engineering and resilience reshaped the skies forever. It began with whispers over the radio. Pilots from Luftwaffe 3 were the first to notice. Something was wrong with the American formations, not in how they flew, but in what accompanied them. By the fall of 1943, Luftwaffe veterans like Adolf Galland and Walter Dahl had grown accustomed to the rhythm of daylight bombing raids. The Americans flew with discipline, their formations tight and coordinated, but everyone knew their weakness. The escort fighters always turned back. It was a pattern etched into muscle memory. Over the Netherlands, the P-47s would disappear. Near Frankfurt, the Lightnings peeled away. What followed was routine destruction. The moment the bombers crossed into central Germany, the sky turned red with tracers. Then the reports changed. At first, it was disbelief. Spotters in Münster claimed they saw fighters still with the bombers well beyond the usual range. That was dismissed as error. But then, pilots near Kassel made the same observation. Something unfamiliar, a new shape in the sky. Longer fuselage, slimmer wings, a single powerful engine, and a tail that seemed to stretch farther than any German aircraft. It wasn't a Thunderbolt, and it certainly wasn't turning back. It was the P-51. By January 1944, they were everywhere. No longer limited to fringe roles, the Mustang had stepped into the center stage of the Allied air campaign. And for the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe faced something they didn't understand: a fighter that stayed. German intercept groups like JG-26 and JG-2 quickly realized that their old tactics no longer worked. They would climb high and wait for the bombers to enter unescorted airspace. Then they would dive in from the sun using speed and surprise to take down 2 or 3 fortresses before the American gunners could coordinate a response. But now, when they rolled into their attack runs, Mustangs were already there, waiting. In the first weeks of 1944, dozens of Luftwaffe pilots were shot down not by bomber fire, but by American escort fighters actively hunting them. Dogfights erupted at altitudes over 30,000 feet. Battles that once lasted seconds now dragged out for minutes, and the Germans were losing. It was not just a matter of numbers or performance. It was a matter of mindset. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine on offensive speed, strike and vanish, but the Mustangs brought endurance. They could climb as high as a Messerschmitt, turn tighter than a Focke-Wulf, and pursue retreating aircraft deep into German territory. There was no retreat, no pause. Even experienced German aces felt it. Joseph Priller once remarked after a mission, "They came from nowhere. I shot at one and missed. Then another was behind me. I never saw it coming." Morale began to erode. One of the clearest signs came from the airfields. Mechanics in Western Germany reported Mustangs strafing their bases hours after bomber formations had passed. American fighters were now operating with autonomy, hunting not just in the sky but on the ground. Fuel convoys, radar stations, trains moving replacement aircraft, all were now targets. And that is when the language changed. German pilots stopped calling the Mustangs fighters. They began calling them shadows, phantoms. There was a new superstition spreading in the mess halls, the idea that no matter where you flew, the Mustang would find you. It wasn't entirely irrational. With drop tanks, the P-51 could fly nearly 1,600 miles. It had a range never before seen in a single-engine fighter. Even the vaunted Me-109s couldn't match that reach. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent, and with each passing week, the Allies flooded more Mustangs into the European theater. By March 1944, the pattern was clear. The sky no longer had safe zones. One Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his journal, after surviving a mission over Hanover, "I looked over my shoulder the entire flight. Not once did I relax. We used to know where the danger ended. Now, it follows us. Home." That line captures something that cannot be measured by statistics: psychological erosion. Because it wasn't just about losing planes. It was about losing control, losing predictability. The Luftwaffe was designed for bursts of violence. The Mustang brought constant pressure. That pressure forced German commanders to rethink strategies on the fly. It caused hesitation in the air, confusion on the ground, and dread in the hearts of even the most seasoned pilots. And dread is contagious. On multiple occasions, bomber gunners reported seeing German fighters break off their approach before engaging. They saw the glint of silver Mustangs at high altitude and decided to live another day. Even among the German high command, there was confusion. Debriefings turned frantic. Reports became inconsistent. How many American fighters are there? Where are they coming from? Why are they still here? But there were no answers, only shadows. This shift in the mental landscape of war marked a turning point that historians often underestimate, because what the P-51 brought wasn't just range or firepower. It brought uncertainty, and in war, uncertainty is a silent killer. If you found this chapter as intriguing as we did, take a second to share your thoughts below. Tell us how you felt hearing about the psychological warfare fought from cockpit to cockpit. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to keep exploring the hidden turning points of history that changed everything in the sky. 2. Truly understand what made the Mustang such a terrifying presence in the skies over Europe, you have to look beyond the kill counts and factory blueprints. You have to understand the machine itself, not as a collection of metal and rivets, but as a force that blended engineering precision with industrial willpower. The P-51 was not designed to impress. It was designed to survive, to endure, to dominate. Its shape was sleek, its frame narrow, its wings long and almost delicate at first glance. But within that form hid a predator, fast, relentless, patient. At the heart of the Mustang was the Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the United States, but based on the original Rolls-Royce design that powered the Spitfire. The difference was in the combination. The Spitfire had the beauty. The Mustang had the reach. The Merlin V1650 engine gave the P-51 the altitude performance it desperately needed. It could climb to over 41,000 feet, where German bombers and fighters once believed themselves untouchable. With a top speed pushing 440 miles per hour and a service range exceeding 1,600 miles with drop tanks, the Mustang was not just fast, it was tireless. Then came the weapons. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing. These weren't just firepower, they were industrial thunder. Each could fire at 800 rounds per minute, creating a lethal wall of lead that chewed through armor and aircraft alike. Pilots reported the sound of those guns not as a wee-chee-chee series of bursts, but as one long, ripping growl. It echoed in the sky like a warning bell no one could unhear. To German pilots used to diving and fleeing in the faster Messerschmitt 109 or the rugged Focke-Wulf 190, this gun line was a nightmare. If they misjudged their angle, if they pulled out too late, the Mustang would be there, waiting with its teeth bared. And yet, it was not just the hardware that struck fear. It was the way it moved. The Mustang flew like it knew something the others didn't. It did not dance or dart. It stalked. It chased with quiet fury. Its wing profile, designed with a laminar flow, reduced drag so efficiently that the aircraft sliced through the air like a razor across skin. When a Mustang dove, it felt like gravity belonged to it. When it climbed, it seemed to defy physics. One German pilot described his first dogfight against the P-51 in chilling terms. "I saw it coming up from beneath, fast, too fast. I rolled and turned, but it followed like it was reading my mind. Then it disappeared and I thought I had escaped. I was wrong. It came back around from above, and then I heard the sound. That hammer. That terrible hammer. They called it Roosevelt's hammer. Not officially, not in the records, but among German fighter squadrons, that was the name whispered between sorties. It was the first American aircraft they feared before seeing. But even beyond combat, the Mustang began shifting the entire aerial strategy of the Allies. Because it didn't just escort bombers. It created new possibilities. With Mustangs, bomber formations could fly deeper, stay longer, and attack more precisely. Factories that had been safe due to distance were now within range. Supply lines that had never been touched were now vulnerable. The reach of the P-51 allowed Allied planners to think differently. Missions were no longer built around survival. They were built around destruction, controlled, methodical, and permanent. And when the Mustangs were not flying high over the bombers, they were diving low over enemy infrastructure, strafing trains, convoys, bridges, hunting German logistics with surgical cruelty. In the spring of 1944, P-51 squadrons began launching fighter sweeps, missions with no bombers at all, designed purely to engage and eliminate Luftwaffe fighters before they could even reach the bombers. It was a reversal of roles. The hunters had become the hunted. What terrified German command was that the Mustang seemed endless. Every week more of them appeared, and they never tired. Day after day, mission after mission, wave after wave. It was not the prowess of individual pilots that overwhelmed the Luftwaffe. It was the consistency. Industrialized combat. American factories were producing nearly 300 Mustangs per month by early 1944. That number would grow, and unlike many German designs, which were rushed to adapt and often plagued by shortages, the Mustang remained stable, reliable, and abundant. Pilots loved it. Ground crews praised it. Commanders trusted it. When the Mustang began appearing in larger numbers over France and Belgium, resistance fighters reported a strange pattern. In occupied towns, children learned to tell the difference between aircraft sounds, the deep rumble of the four-engine bombers, the sharp whine of the German 109s, and then the Mustang's signature low snarl. That sound came to mean something. Hope for the German pilots. It meant the opposite. There's a detail often lost in the official history books. After missions, Luftwaffe squadrons began placing armed guards near their own fuel trucks, not to protect against Allied bombing, but because morale was collapsing. Some pilots had started puncturing their own fuel lines before missions, claiming mechanical failure, just to avoid facing the Mustangs again. Desperation makes men do strange things, and when you are being hunted by something faster, smarter, and endlessly supplied, even the proudest warrior begins to question the sky. If you are enjoying these deeper human and mechanical layers behind the most legendary warplanes in history, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Every voice helps keep this history alive. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, subscribing is a powerful way to keep it flying. By early 1944, the war in the air had shifted, not just in range or firepower, but in philosophy. The arrival of the Mustang had not only extended the reach of Allied bombers, it had redrawn the battlefield entirely. What had once been defensive missions, designed to simply survive the gauntlet of German fighters, became aggressive operations aimed at dismantling the Luftwaffe from the inside out. The Americans had moved from endurance to offense. At the center of this evolution was a new strategy: fighter sweeps. No longer content to wait for enemy fighters to come to the bombers, Mustang squadrons were now launched ahead of the main formations. Their sole purpose was to roam freely over German airspace, hunting down any aircraft that dared leave the ground. This tactic was brutal in its simplicity. Wake early, take off before dawn, cross the channel, find, destroy, return. There were no bombers to protect, no fixed routes, no set objectives beyond one chilling mandate: gain air superiority by eliminating the Luftwaffe's ability to fly. One pilot from the 357th Fighter Group described it this way: "We weren't protecting bombers anymore. We were clearing the skies. We went out there to find trouble, and we found it." These missions were relentless. P-51 squadrons would sweep over airfields, catching German fighters just after takeoff or as they circled for landing. Others would wait above known transit corridors, picking off high-altitude interceptors before they could form up. The goal was not just to shoot down aircraft, it was to choke the Luftwaffe at its roots. And it worked. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe began to suffer not from a lack of planes, but a lack of pilots. The skies over Germany became a meat grinder for even the most experienced men. Veterans who had flown since the Battle of Britain now found themselves hunted by younger, better armed, and better supplied American pilots. Worse still was the rate at which new pilots were being lost. Training programs in Germany had been shortened to meet demand. Once it took more than a year to become a fighter pilot. Now it took 12 weeks. These young men were sent up with minimal flight hours, poor tactical understanding, and a growing sense of dread. They were met in the air by Mustangs, pilots who had already flown dozens of combat sorties, pilots who flew in tight formations, communicated seamlessly, and had full confidence in their machines. It was not a fair fight. Reports from German officers told of squadrons that never even saw the enemy before being destroyed, planes that vanished in the clouds, radios that screamed once and went silent. Airfields once considered safe zones were now death traps. In one harrowing example, on April 5, 1944, P-51s from the 354th Fighter Group launched a low-level sweep over the German airfield at Göttingen. They arrived just as a group of Focke-Wulfs were taxiing for takeoff. In less than 3 minutes, 8 fighters were destroyed on the ground. Fuel trucks exploded, hangars burned, and the runway was left cratered with bomb strikes. It was a massacre, but it was also strategic warfare. Every pilot lost was not just a man. It was 6 months of training, thousands of liters of fuel, spare parts, and infrastructure, and Germany could no longer afford to replace them. There is a phrase used by many historians to describe what happened during these months: attrition from above. The Americans weren't simply attacking planes, they were bleeding the Luftwaffe from the sky down to the foundations of its command structure. The fear became institutional. Luftwaffe ground crews began building camouflage, netting over hangars. Dummy aircraft were placed around airfields to mislead incoming Mustangs. Flight schedules were shifted to nighttime operations where possible. But the Mustangs adapted. Nighttime escorts increased. Low-altitude radar installations were destroyed. There was no longer a safe time to fly. One German pilot returning from a failed intercept mission wrote in his logbook, "We now lose planes before we even reach the bombers. The Americans come to us. They wait in our skies. And, when we appear, they pounce like wolves." Even Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was forced to acknowledge the shift. In a meeting in May 1944, he reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "If I see Mustangs over Berlin, I know the war is lost." By then, Mustangs had already been there for months. The weight of that realization was not just tactical, it was psychological. The Luftwaffe had once flown with pride, with swagger. It had ruled the skies over Poland, over France, and over the early years of the Eastern Front. But now, even in their own territory, they flew with caution. Every scramble was a risk. Every engagement was a coin toss. And while the Luftwaffe dwindled, the Mustang kept coming, one after another, factory fresh, fully armed, and flown by men who no longer feared crossing the German border. The Mustang was not a miracle weapon. It was a tool of pressure, precise, quiet, and continuous. It hunted high, it struck low, it lingered, and most of all, it reminded that nowhere was safe. If this window into the systematic unraveling of air dominance has resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. These stories aren't just about machines. They're about moments when the tide turned, quietly, methodically, and without mercy. And if you value this kind of deep historical narrative, subscribing is one of the best ways to support our mission. The Luftwaffe was never supposed to break. It was engineered for resilience, commanded by veterans, and powered by one of the most advanced aviation industries in the world. In the early years of the war, its fighters tore through the skies over Poland and France like blades through paper. It had ruled above the beaches of Dunkirk and had made the skies over London burn during the Blitz. But by mid-1944, the cracks were no longer subtle. They were fractures, and they were widening fast. The cause wasn't one single aircraft or one perfect pilot. It was exhaustion. The Mustang had accelerated a truth that the German High Command had long tried to ignore, that even the most advanced air force on Earth could not survive without time, resources, and most importantly, experience. That last one was vanishing faster than fuel. The Luftwaffe's veteran corps, men who had been flying since 1939, were being hunted from the skies, killed in action, or forced into administrative roles after injury or burnout. Their absence left a void that could not be filled by machines. Young pilots, many barely 19, were being pushed through training programs that had been slashed from 12 months to 12 weeks. They were handed aircraft and orders. Some had never flown in formation. Others had never even fired their weapons in flight before facing American fighters with hundreds of hours of combat experience. It was tactical suicide disguised as desperation. These new recruits weren't unbrave. They were simply unprepared. The Allies, meanwhile, were refining everything. Mustang squadrons were rotating seasoned aces with new arrivals, allowing experience to spread like wildfire. Pilots debriefed after every mission, sharing enemy weaknesses and identifying ambush points. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a system. One American pilot from the 361st Fighter Group remembered engaging a group of German fighters near Magdeburg. They came at us straight. No angles, no tactics. Just pure head-on. We knew they were green. We pulled high and rolled behind them. 3 were gone before they even turned around. This imbalance widened daily. For every skilled German pilot lost, 2 rookies took his place, and most would not live to see a second month of flying. Entire squadrons became revolving doors, names on a chalkboard in the morning, crosses on a report by nightfall. The German command responded with denial. Some Luftwaffe officers clung to old doctrines. They believed the Mustang was overhyped, that a few lucky victories were being exaggerated. Others insisted that the solution was technological, that new jet fighters like the Me-262 would turn the tide. But jets required fuel, and fuel was vanishing. In early 1944, Allied bombing raids began specifically targeting synthetic oil plants in Germany. Ploesti, Leuna, Merseburg, facilities that once powered the German war machine, now smoldered beneath clouds of smoke. Without fuel, even the most advanced fighter becomes a coffin with wings. Pilots began flying with half loads. Training flights were cancelled. Emergency landings became routine, and the Mustang still waited. German ground crews reported the same haunting pattern. Engines starting late, planes sputtering on takeoff. And then that sound. A low hum building into a roar. Silver shapes descending like judgment from above. There was nowhere left to hide. Airfields were camouflaged, then rebuilt. Planes were moved between forests. Some squadrons operated out of highways. It didn't matter. The Mustang had become omnipresent. It wasn't just attacking. It was erasing. One pilot from Jägerschwader 54 returned from a sortie missing part of his wing. His squadron had lost 6 aircraft in under 5 minutes. He walked into the operations tent, took off his gloves, and said one sentence before sitting in silence. They were already there. This phrase echoed in reports across the country. They were already there. The Americans had done something that no one expected. They had reversed the fear. Early in the ET war, Allied pilots feared German skies. They feared Messerschmitts screaming down from the sun. They feared being caught without support. Now, it was the Germans who looked over their shoulders. It was the Germans who hesitated before climbing, because death no longer arrived with warning. It arrived with the Mustang. And yet, the most devastating part was not the combat. It was the silence that followed. In squadrons across Germany, barracks grew quieter. Letters stopped arriving. Celebrations became rare. The Luftwaffe had been built on pride and precision, on ceremony and tradition. Now it survived on delay and retreat. Even Göring's once booming presence in Berlin's command rooms began to shrink. His speeches turned bitter, his promises less believable. and his silence more frequent. He had once declared the sky belonged to Germany, but the sky no longer listened. It belonged to the aircraft that could stay longer, fly farther, and strike harder. It belonged to the men who no longer feared crossing the border. It belonged to the roar of 6 machine guns echoing through the high clouds. It belonged to a machine that was not born out of desperation, but out of foresight, to a nation that didn't just build airplanes, but built an entire system around them. And as German pilots stared upward, hoping for one more lucky return, they no longer asked where the enemy was. They asked how long it would take before the enemy arrived, and they already knew the answer. If this part of the story stirred something in you, take a moment to reflect and share your impressions below. Every comment helps bring these stories back to life. If you believe history deserves to be remembered with depth and humanity, subscribing is a small act with a lasting impact. By May of 1945, the skies over Germany were no longer contested. They were silent. The kind of silence that only follows a storm so large it rewrites the air itself. The kind of silence that isn't peace, but the absence of resistance. The war in the air was over long before the war on the ground had ended. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was no longer visible above its own homeland. Its planes were grounded, its airfields shattered, its fuel reserves exhausted, and the few remaining pilots, those who had survived years of ceaseless sorties and mounting losses, were no longer flying with purpose. They were surviving by instinct, avoiding the sky that had once made them gods. What remained above was the long shadow of American air power, and at the center of that shadow, the Mustang. It flew not with urgency anymore, but with authority. It no longer needed to race to save bombers or fight its way back to England. Now it circled slowly, deliberately, over a nation that once believed it was invincible. It flew over broken rail yards, over silent factories, over cities stripped of ambition and breath. By then, the Mustang had become more than a plane. It was a message. It said that no matter how skilled a pilot might be, no matter how advanced the tactics or passionate the defense, war belonged to those who could sustain it. It belonged to those who could keep producing, keep flying, keep adapting, even when the skies turned black with smoke and the losses felt endless. The Germans had talent, but talent could not outlast pressure. And pressure was what the Mustang brought, day after day, without pause. It didn't win the war alone. No aircraft ever could. But it allowed the bombing campaign to evolve from a desperate gamble into a systematic dismantling of the enemy's ability to fight. It gave the Allies reach, precision, dominance. It turned the sky into a domain, not a battlefield. Many German pilots who survived the war later spoke with awe about the Mustang. Not hatred, not bitterness, but respect. Some admitted that when they first saw the P-51 over Berlin, they understood, deep down, that the war had entered its final chapter. Because when your enemy can fly over your capital, fight your best, and return home untouched, there is nothing left to contest. There is only time, and that time was running out. From the high peaks of the Alps to the lowland airfields of Bavaria, the Mustang became a familiar silhouette. For those on the ground, it was both a symbol of destruction and of inevitability. For prisoners of war, it was the sound of hope. For resistance fighters, a promise. And for German soldiers retreating across ruined landscapes, a reminder that the war they had once believed winnable was now a matter of survival. Even in the final days, as surrender became certain, Mustangs flew missions of mercy, escorting reconnaissance planes, monitoring ceasefire zones, or simply showing presence. Their roar no longer terrified. It declared. It declared that the sky now belonged to something greater than any single pilot, plane, or nation. It belonged to the future. And when the guns fell silent on May 8, 1945, victory in Europe Day. It was under the watchful eyes of machines that had outlasted terror and turned fear into control. The P-51s returned to their airfields not in triumph, but in completion. They had done their job. No fanfare, no parades, just the quiet hiss of hydraulics and the smell of oil cooling on concrete. Machines that flew too long, fought too hard, and asked for nothing in return. But their legacy endured. Today, The Mustang is remembered not just as a technological marvel, but as a turning point. A moment in history where the sky, once ruled by aces and improvisation, became a realm of system, strategy, and scale. It was where industry met bravery, where horsepower met purpose. It is not nostalgia we feel when we see a P-51 soaring at an air show. It is remembrance of sacrifice, of resilience, and of the idea that even in a world shattered by war, precision and persistence can still forge a path through chaos. So the next time you hear that unmistakable engine note, deep, proud, steady, know that you are not just hearing metal and fuel. You are hearing a symbol, a survivor, and a story that deserves to be told again and again. Thank you for flying through this story with us. If this journey moved you, if you felt the weight and wonder of these forgotten skies, leave your thoughts below. Your voice is part of this history now. And don't forget to subscribe, not just for more stories, but to help keep alive the memory of those who flew not to be remembered, but so that others could live. Click on the next video appearing on your screen to continue exploring the hidden layers of World War II aviation. We'll see you up there.